What's going on, guys? James from the Research Revolution. Hey, good news. David Rockefeller is dead. Sorry to be so cold, but this guy was trying to take down America and did a pretty damn good job of it. And now he's probably in hell burning. David Rockefeller, philanthropist and head of Chase Manhattan, dies at 101 years old. Mr. Rockefeller was influential in foreign affairs, helped resolve New York's financial crisis in the 1970s, and was chairman of the Museum of Modern Art for many years. Okay. David Rockefeller, the banker and philanthropist with the fabled family name, who controlled Chase Manhattan Bank for more than a decade and wielded vast influence around the world even longer as he spread the gospel of American capitalism, died on a Monday morning at his home in Pocantico Hills, New York. He was 101. The family spokesman, Fraser P. Seitel, confirmed the death. Chase Manhattan had long been known as the Rockefeller Bank, though the family never owned more than 5% of its shares. But Mr. Rockefeller was more than a steward, you see. As a chairman and chief executive throughout the 1970s, he made it David's Bank, as many called it, expanding its operations internationally. Oh, David's Bank. Oh, it sounds cute. David's Bank. His stature was greater than any corporate title might convey, however. His influence was felt in Washington and foreign capitals, in the corridors of New York City government, art museums, great universities, and public schools. Yeah, wasn't he the shadow in the shadow government? Mr. Rockefeller could well be the last of an increasingly less visible family to have cut so imposing a figure on the world stage. As a prophylactic advocate for the economic interests of the United States and of his own bank, he was a force in global financial affairs and in his country's foreign policy. He was received in foreign capitals with the honors according to whatever. This bunch of crap. He was the last surviving grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the tycoon who founded Standard Oil Company in the 19th century and built a fortune that made him America's first billionaire and his family one of the richest and most powerful in nation's history. As an heir to that great legacy, Mr. Rockefeller lived all his life in a baronial splendor and privilege. Whether in Manhattan as a boy, he and his brothers would roller skate along Fifth Avenue, trailed by a limousine in case they grew tired. Oh! Or his magnificent country estates. Oh, what a silver spoon you got in your mouth, sir. Imbued with the understated manners of the East Coast elite, he loomed large in the upper reaches of New York social life, a social world of glittering black-tie galas. His philanthropy was monumental, and so was his art collection, a museum-like repository of some 15,000 pieces, many of them masterpieces, some lining the walls of his office, 56 floors above the streets at Rockefeller Center, to which he repaired, robust and active, well into his 90s. I see. In silent testimony to his power and reach was his Rolodex, a catalog of some 150,000 names of people he had met as a banker statesman. It required a room of its own beside his office. Spread out below that corporate area was a city he loved and influenced mightily. He was instrumental in rallying the private sector to help resolve New York City's financial fiscal crisis in the mid-1970s. As a chairman of the Museum of Modern Art for many years, his mother had helped found it in 1929. He led the effort to encourage corporations to buy and display art in their office buildings and to subsidize local museums. As a chairman of the New York City Partnership, a coalition of business executives, he fostered innovation in public schools and the development of thousands of apartments for lower income and middle class families. Oh, good boy. He was always aware of the mystique surrounding the Rockefeller name. I have never found it a hindrance, he said once with a typical reserve. Obviously, there are times when I'm aware that I'm treated differently. There's no question that having financial resources, which, thanks to my parents, I learned to use with some restraint and discretion, is a big advantage. Ambassador for business. With his powerful name and his zeal for foreign travel, he was still traveling to Europe into his late 90s. Mr. Rockefeller was a formidable marketing force. In the 1970s, his meetings with Anwar el-Sadat of Egypt, Leonard Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, and Zhou Enlil of China helped Chase Manhattan become the first American bank with operations in those countries. Few people in this country have met as many leaders as I have, he said. Some faulted him for spending so much time abroad. He was accused of neglecting his responsibilities at Chase and failing to promote aggressive, visionary managers. Under his leadership, Chase fell far behind its rival Citibank, then the nation's largest bank, in assets and earnings. There were years when Chase had the most troubled loan portfolio among major American banks. In my judgment, he will not go down in history as a great banker. John J. McCloy, a Rockefeller friend and himself a former Chase chairman, told the Associated Press in 1981, he will go down as a real personality, as a distinguished and loyal member of the community. Sure. His forays into international politics also drew criticism, notably in 1979, when he and former Secretary of State Henry A. Kissinger persuaded President Jimmy Carter to admit the recently deposed the Shah of Iran into the United States for cancer treatment. The Shah's arrival in New York enraged revolutionary followers of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, providing them to seize the United States Embassy in Iran and hold American diplomats hostage for more than 1 year. Mr. Rockefeller was assailed as well as for befriending autocratic foreign leaders in an effort to establish and extend his bankers' presence in their countries. What about the hitman? Aren't you guys going to talk about the economic hitman? Huh? He spent his life in the club of the ruling class and was loyal to members of the club, no matter what they did. He was loyal no matter what they did. Like raping kids? The New York Times columnist David Brooks wrote in 2002, citing the profitable deals Mr. Rockefeller had cut with oil-rich dictators, Soviet party bosses, and Chinese proprietors of the Cultural Revolution. Still presidents as ideologically different as Mr. Carter and Richard M. Nixon offered him the post of Treasury Secretary. He turned them both down. After the death in 1979 of his older brother, Nelson, a Rockefeller, the former vice president and four-time governor of New York, David Rockefeller, stood almost alone as the remaining family member with an outsized national profile. Only J. Rockefeller, a great-grandson of John D. Rockefeller, had earned prominence as a governor and United States Senator from West Virginia. No one from the family's younger generations has attained or perhaps aspired to David Rockefeller's statue. No one can step into his shoes, Warren T. Lindquist, a longtime friend, told the Times in 1995, not because they aren't good, smart, talented people, but because it's just a different world. Yeah, it's a different world because you guys changed it. A privileged life. Oh, let's read about his privileged life. Oh, this is just newsworthy. The youngest of six siblings, David Rockefeller was born in Manhattan on June 12, 1915. His father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., was only son of the oil titan, devoted his life to philanthropy. His mother, Abby Aldridge Rockefeller, was the daughter of Nelson Aldridge, a wealthy senator from Rhode Island. Besides Nelson, born in 1908, the other children were Abby, who was born in 1903 and died in 1976 after living a private life. John D. Rockefeller III, who was born in 1906 and immersed himself in philanthropy until his death in an automobile accident in 1978. Lawrence was born in 1910, who was an environmentalist and died in 2004, and Winthrop, born in 1912, who was governor of Arkansas and died in 1973. David, the youngest, grew up in a mansion at 10 West 54th Street, the largest private residence in the city at the time. It bustled with valets, parlour-maids, nurses, and chambermaids. For dinner every night, his father dressed in black tie and his mother in a formal gown. Summers were spent at the 107-room Rockefeller Cottage in Seal Harbor. Weekends at Kykute, the family's country compound north of the city in Tarrytown, New York. The estate was likened to a feudal fief, as Mr. Rockefeller wrote in his autobiography, Memoirs, 2002. Eventually, the family accumulated about 3,400 acres that surrounded and included almost all of the little village of Pocantico Hills, where most of the residents worked for the family and lived in houses owned by the grandfather. In that bucolic setting, he developed a fascination for insects that would lead to his building one of the largest beetle collections in the world. David was 21 when John D. Rockefeller died. He told amusing stories and sang little ditties, Mr. Rockefeller recalled in 2002. He gave us dimes. His sense of noblesse oblige was heightened by his earlier education at the experimental Lincoln School in Manhattan, founded by the American philosopher John Dewey, and financed by the Rockefeller Foundation to bring together children from varied social backgrounds. He went on to study at Harvard, receiving his B.S. in 1936, and then spent a year at the London School of Economics, a hotbed of socialist intellectuals. Mr. Rockefeller was awarded Ph.D. in economics from the University of Chicago in 1940. Moved by the Great Depression at home and abroad, he stated in his doctoral thesis that he was inclined to agree with the New Deal that deficit financing during depressions, other things being equal, is a help to recovery. The notion that a Rockefeller would take such a liberal economic view was major news. The family, rock-ribbed Republican, was known for its fierce opposition to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal's author. After receiving his doctorate, Mr. Rockefeller became secretary to Portello H. La Gardenia, New York's pugnacious liberal Republican mayor. In 1940, he married Margaret McGrath, known as Peggy, whom he had met at a dance 7 years earlier, when he was a Harvard freshman and she was a student at the Chaplin School in New York City. His wife, a dedicated conservationist, died at 80 in 1996. They had 6 children: David Jr., Abby, Neva, Margaret, Richard, and Aline. A complete list of his survivors was not immediately available. Mr. Rockefeller enlisted in the Army in 1942, attended officer training school, and served in North Africa and France in World War II. He was discharged a captain in 1945. He began his banking career in 1946 as an assistant manager with the Chase Manhattan Bank, which merged in 1955 with the Bank of Manhattan's company to become Chase Manhattan. Banking in the early post-war era was a gentleman's profession. Top executives could attain to outside interest, using social contracts to cultivate clients, while leaving day-to-day management to junior officers. Mr. Rockefeller found plenty of time for such activities. In the late 1940s, he replaced his mother on the Museum of Modern Art's board and eventually became its chairman. He courted art collectors. In 1968, he put together a syndicate. Oh, a syndicate, eh? Including his brother Nelson and the CBS chairman, William S. Paley, to buy Gertrude Stein's collection of modern art. David and Peggy Rockefeller owned Praz paintings by Cezanne Gongun, Matisse, Picasso were lent to the museum permanently, expanding a bank globally. Mr. Rockefeller's rise in banking was swift. By 1961, he was president of Chase Manhattan and its co-chief executive with George Champion, the chairman. Promoting expansion overseas, Mr. Rockefeller clashed with Mr. Champion, who thought that the bank's domestic business was more important. After Mr. Rockefeller replaced Mr. Champion as chairman and sole chief executive in 1969, he was able to enlarge the bank's presence on almost every continent. He said his brand of personal diplomacy, meeting with heads of state, was crucial in furthering Chase's interests and his interests and the New World Order's interests, you see. There were many who claimed these activities were inappropriate and interfered with my bank responsibilities, Mr. Rockefeller wrote in his autobiography. I couldn't disagree more. His so-called outside activities, we'll call them, he insisted were of considerable benefit to the bank, both financially and in terms of its prestige around the world. By 1976, Chase Manhattan's international arm was contributing 80% of the bank's $105 million in operating profit, but instead of vindicating Mr. Rockefeller's avidity for banking abroad, those figures underline Chase's lagging performance at home. From 1974 to 1976, its earnings fell 36%, while those of its biggest rivals, Bank of America, Citibank, Manufacturers Hanover, and J.P. Morgan, rose 12 to 31%. His whole life is just money. In 1974, recession hammered Chase, which had an unusually large portfolio of loans in the depressed real estate industry. It also owned more New York-related securities than any other bank in the mid-1970s, when the city was edging towards bankruptcy. And among major banks, Chase had the largest portfolio of non-performing loans there. It's going to keep going. Yeah. I'm not reading all this. Are you kidding me? Here, we'll read the last couple articles here. It says, as an octogenarian, Mr. Rockefeller, whose fortune was estimated in 2012 as $2.7 billion, increasingly devoted himself to philanthropy, donating tens of millions of dollars, in particular to Harvard, the Museum of Modern Art, the Rockefeller University, which John D. Rockefeller Sr. founded in 1901. Even in his 90s, Mr. Rockefeller continued to work at a pace that would tire a much younger person. He traveled more than half the year on behalf of Chase or groups like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. By 2005, when he was interviewed in his office at Rockefeller Center, he had remained physically active, working with a trainer at the center's sports club. He continued to collect art, including hundreds of paintings, as well as works in colored glass, porcelain, petrified wood, and furniture. The same year, he pledged a $100 million bequest to the Museum of Modern Art. Such giving became grist for a society's page. One celebrity-filled fundraising gala at the museum in 2005 drew 850 people, paying as much as $90,000 for a table. The occasion was Mr. Rockefeller's 90th birthday, and at the end of the evening he was presented with a birthday cake modeled after his house in Maine. Then it was off to a week in southern France to continue a celebration with 21 members of his family. With the book Memoirs in 2002, he became, at age 87, the first in 3 generations of Rockefellers to publish an autobiography. Asked why he wrote it, he replied in his characteristic reserved tone, "Well, it just occurred to me that I had led a rather interesting life." Indeed, Mr. Rockefeller, indeed. So I guess his like 50th, what was it? No, literally it was like his 15th heart transplant didn't take. So once again, guys, David Rockefeller is dead. This has been James from the Research Revolution. I'm out of here.